Hello everybody, it's Peter with an I, S-T-A-W-A-R-T. Welcome to segment 31 of, I don't know, the Dark Tower, I guess?
He muttered to himself while he went through the motions of explaining some sort of information he would have to know for the class. Polly found it impossible to keep his lips from moving and whispering out loud. Is so effective in memorizing and mastering complex ideas and preparing for the delivery of such ideas to anyone who should ask, that sometimes it needs to be countered or turned off. To keep grounded, Polly would keep a sharpened tack with him and give himself a poke when he got too boisterous. The painful poke would shock him back to reality and remind him that people were not only around him, but also looking at him funny. People on the bus would think it was equally bizarre, or even more bizarre yet, when they witnessed him poking himself with a sharpened tack. So Polly kept the tack hidden deep inside his pants pocket. Ideally, he would keep it in his back pocket, but he worried that his mom might find little blood spots in the back of his underwear and think that he was up to mischief. So he kept the tack in his front pocket. Anyone who watched Polly out of the corner of their eye, that is, anyone who rode the city bus while he was on board, would see him sitting there with his hand buried deep in his front pocket, sweating and baring his teeth as he winced from time to time. Polly once got the courage to ask a girl who rode the bus out on a date, but she said no. Polly had academic smarts,
but in this case, she demonstrated smart smarts.
"Do you recognize any of these people?" asked Joe after taking a look around the room. Frank looked back and saw a kid they used to go to school with. He used to help monitor the halls and make sure that anyone wandering around during class hours had a pass. He used to harass both Frank and Joe to no end, and their feuds were bitter. "Hey, Frank, Joe!" Terrence greeted them as if he saw his long-lost best friends. Aside from the developing bald spot on his head, Terrence looked pretty much the same, but now he was really cool. Terrence honestly didn't remember harassing the two boys. To him, any disagreements they might have had were all in the name of good fun. Frank buried the past, and the two were talking, getting along richly. Joe was a little more standoffish. He wasn't one to hold grudges, but he had a hard time forgetting the dislocated arm Terrence gave him, and found it difficult to remember the concussion he received. Chapter 29. As they talked about what they had been up to, the TA came in and started counting students in each row and handing the end person a certain number of sheets to pass along. Their instructor, the dentist, wouldn't be showing up that day, and instead the beginning students were to take a placement test. When Joe got his test, he looked it over. The first section was a bunch of math problems, ranging from simple to hard. Joe was terrible at math. He skipped to the next section, which had to do with other technical skills. Joe had always done well in school, but this was like hitting a stone wall. It was the same kind of rude awakening as when his old school gave the standardized testing. Neither Frank or Joe thought it had anything to do with scholastic skills. They thought they were going to get their eyes checked to make sure they were standard. Hence the name, Standard Eyes Testing. The TA left the room, and Joe looked around for hidden cameras. "Hey, Frank," whispered Joe. Frank had been clipping along quite well. He was actually doing pretty good at the math section. "Huh, what?" he replied, looking around to make sure nobody was watching. "You don't have to whisper," said Terrence. "The test is for you. It's probably not even going to be handed in. In fact, you don't even have to take it if you don't really want to. But I suggest you do, to make sure you belong here." The idea that the test was for him, for his benefit, struck Joe as completely odd. He took an account of where he was, and what he was doing there, and it dawned on him that he wasn't even forced to be there. He could just leave if he wanted to, and the only reason he would stay is if he desired to. This was entirely alien to anything Frank or Joe had ever known. The only reason they were ever on time for class, or paid a jewel of attention while they were there, was purely to satisfy the teacher's demonic desire to torture kids by forcing facts into their heads. But here, the instructor didn't really care if they learned. In fact, if any one of the students didn't want to learn, they weren't wanted there. And if any of them cheated, it would only mean they would be incompetent in their technical duties later on. Joe buckled down and concentrated. A lot of the stuff seemed vaguely familiar, and he recognized a few of the terms, but what he did know was lost in a thick gumbo soup of memory. "Can I see your first page?" asked Joe. "The key is on the back if you want to look the answers up," said Frank. After the test, they headed out with their new books under their arms. Joe was convinced they weren't going to even read 1/10 of those books. In the quest to push children through the education system quicker and quicker, Joe's former teachers were forced to throw out about 90% of the stuff in the text. To cram it all in and read everything, kids would have to learn how to speed read. And of course, when it comes to complex information, speed reading does little good. Joe was confident he would make it through the class with no major hang-ups. After all, he had always been smarter than most people, or at least he pictured himself as smarter. And even though Frank might have done well in the math section, as well as the other sections, Joe knew he would surpass him because Frank had always been intolerably dumb. Joe remembered when they were on a committee and there was a heads-down vote. Nobody told Frank to pull his head up after the polls had been taken, and Frank sat there the whole time with his head down on his desk. Joe snickered to himself, shaking his head. That evening, Frank sat around reading. His success on the test that day had inspired him. Years ago, there was no way he could have understood any of that stuff, but it was as if his brain had grown in the last few years, and he could remember things a lot better than before. And the things he was picking up in the first few pages of the text were fascinating. They were wonderful, not only because they were the cream of a millennium of research, but more so because he could comprehend this stuff. The whole experience was bittersweet, because he was years behind. He had to close up his book and head off to his job at the warehouse a few miles away, where he made wooden refrigerator pallets. Life was structured in stages. Years ago was the stage he should have been learning that stuff, and now he was in the full-time occupation stage, when he was expected to have the other stages behind him. He felt like a fool trying to fight it. Back at the house, Nancy had a similar dilemma. Her new job gave her a tremendous appreciation for the amount of time during a day, or rather, the lack of it. She wanted to work on her computer program, but the project simply couldn't be done in short blocks, because she would lose track of the mechanics of what she was doing if she left it alone for any length of time. And the complex circuit maze she had plotted out in her head would turn into a worthless plate of tangled spaghetti. As she sat idle at her keyboard, with her dentures soaking in a glass of water, what possessed her mind was revenge, which, like spaghetti, would be both crimsoned and saucy. Hatred is so consuming that it makes concentration on good things impossible, and concentration on bad things easy. The only way you can concentrate on good things is if you're going to use them for bad things. The brain gets going, all those juices are flowing, and all them neurons are firing. Hate is like a drug. Hatred is also misleading, because the mind feels as though it's finally awake, and the senses are clear. And if they were to let go of their hatred, it would be like letting go of a brick of gold that's just about to be pulled out of a large vase. Letting go of your hatred is sort of like taking your meds. When you're on fire and your thoughts are a-racing, who wants to slow down? When their thoughts are racing, it's probably the only time that stupid people can feel smart. Her fingers didn't touch the keyboard. They weren't used to scribble down diagrams or crunch numbers. As Nancy sat staring off into space, her mind wandered off to another passion. A passion that humbles hatred. It was horror.